Welcome everyone to the first Teen Science Cafe of the year. Thanks for joining us after a very swift summer. Felt like it just flew by. Some of you might vaguely remember me. My name is Cole Anderson, and I'm the coordinator of the Teen Science Cafe. And because I know you all are super invested in my home and garden life, home and garden life, I have a couple brief summer updates. First, garden updates. Most of my crops have died. I have flowers that are taller than I am, and tomatoes that should just be filling my pantry, but the biggest caterpillars in the whole wide world have eaten pretty much every single one of them. Home update. I got 2 new cats. We named them Deimos and Phobos, which means terror and fear, after the sons of Ares, the Greek god of war. And it's also the 2 moons of Mars, so the Roman equivalent of Ares. And so you get a little Greek myth and astronomy in those 2 little Martians. So before we get started, I have a few things to say. First, if you are super interested in the topic, we have tons of great resources that we're going to put in the chat towards the end. Our very own teen advisory member, Eva, found all those for us. At the end of the cafe, please fill out the survey, which I will also put into the chat. This really helps us make the cafe better each time. And especially for next time, we're trying to make it a little more interactive, a little more social. So we want to get your feedback for that. Number 3, we will also have a couple questions peppered throughout the cafe. So you can find those links individually sent in the chat as well. And finally, if you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. For most people, it's at the bottom of the screen. And also, one last thing before I introduce our other moderators, we're going to do one poll so we can just see how many folks we have on each screen. So if Kim can go ahead and pull that up, and if you can please vote on that, well, you know what I mean. So we have some sense of attendance. And I'll just give you a couple more minutes. Thank you, or seconds. All right. Just me. Wow, 11 folks who, all right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Kim, who will be joining us for the first time this evening, Tamara, and Luke. And without further ado, we will all back out and Luke will introduce our speaker for the night. So thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Today's speaker is Dr. Rory. He is an associate professor and the interim chair of the Department of Biology at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. He has a cancer genetics and cell biology laboratory where he studies breast cancer health disparities. His research is focused on understanding the mechanisms of breast cancer health disparities. He uses cell line models to investigate the role that microRNAs in the environment play in the aggressive behavior of triple-negative breast cancer that contributes to these disparities. And here is our speaker.
Hello, good afternoon. I am so delighted to join you all this afternoon, early evening on this Friday. And it does give me great pleasure to share with you all a little bit about what I do in my research laboratory, my research interests. And so I really want to thank Luke for that introduction. And I really want to thank the Teen Science Cafe for inviting me to share with you all a little bit about myself, and what I do. And you can ask any question you would like of me, and I will gladly answer. So I am going to share my screen. With you all and talk a little bit about what I do, what my research entails. So the title of my research and what I'm going to present, and I'm just going to present a little bit about what I do, a little bit about some of the background of my research focus in my laboratory on investigating mechanisms of breast cancer health disparities. So I know that's a long title, and it seemed pretty complex, and it sort of is complex. However, it's important for us as scientists to investigate these things to try to help reduce death when it comes to getting breast cancer. And in doing that, we recognize that there are some what we call disparities. And we're going to learn a little bit about what that is this afternoon. So as Luke said, my name is Chico Rory, and I am the interim chair of the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University, and we're located in Greensboro, North Carolina. So the focus of this talk is to give you some background about breast cancer, and I essentially approach this as breast cancer awareness. So we hear a lot about it. You may know someone who's had breast cancer before, whether they're in your family, friends, associates, or friends of your parents or someone like that. And so I'm just going to give you a few facts about breast cancer. And hopefully these few facts you can use in your studies or in your investigation of this particular disease. And we really do want more people to get involved in the understanding of this disease. So, and you can do that through research. You can also do it as a medical doctor in treating patients. You can also advocate for patients or people who have been diagnosed with breast cancer, who are survivors of breast cancer. You know, you hear a lot about the breast cancer walks. And I think this is a great timing because Breast Cancer Awareness Month is in October. And so there's a few weeks, in a few weeks, you may see some advertisements or invitations on breast cancer awareness. Don't know if the walks and runs will take place this year, you know, but I'm sure there's going to be some opportunities to get involved. And it's very important for everybody to get involved in these type of initiatives. So I have my first question that I would like to ask you all. And, you know, I'm not sure if you've heard of cancer before or have investigated cancer before, but this question is, cancer is defined as, so, you know, what is cancer? And so here are the answer choices for the first poll question. Is cancer defined as a collection of over 100 types of diseases, a genetic disease disorder, where cells grow without stopping, or all of the above? And so I'll give you all half a minute to answer that question. Okay. All right, so we've thought about that a little bit. So now, let's see. And so here's where I go into what is cancer. So it turns out it's all of the above. So cancer is a collection of over 100 types of diseases. And that's because cancer can originate in many different cell types. So, and when we say cell types, what that means is that there's some cells in your body that have specific functions in the body. So a liver cell functions differently than what a nerve cell will function as. A nerve cell functions very differently than, let's say, a cardiac muscle cell would function. So they do different things in the body. And really, any cell can become cancerous, any cell type. You have bone cells, and those can become cancerous. We have white blood cells, and they can become cancer. And so it's very important to try to prevent these cells from becoming cancerous because they can be difficult to treat and cure. And so we also describe cancer as a genetic disease or disorder. That's because when it comes to the cancer cell, there's a lot of genetic changes and mutations that have occurred in those cell types. And so a lot of scientists believe, and we pretty much agree, that more than likely those changes in the genetics of that cell is probably playing a role in that cell becoming cancerous. So, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish whether or not that change in the genetics, and what we call a change in genetics is mutation of a gene. So it's hard sometimes to determine whether or not that change causes the cancer, because there's many different changes that actually occur with the genetics of a cell that can lead to it becoming what we call cancerous. And so what is cancer? It is these cells that grow without stopping. So that under normal conditions, your cell is designed to grow and stop growing at specific times, okay, at times during development. So we all start out as a single cell, okay? But then over time, that single cell becomes millions and then billions of cells. And so there's a control put in place to stop growing at a certain point. And so when you make your liver, there's sometimes you want to make more liver cells, and sometimes you want to make sure you stop making more of those cells, for example. And you can trigger the event of making more cells when you need to, because sometimes, depending on the cell type and the tissue type, sometimes you need to replace some of those cells. But then there's other types when that rarely happens. And so you have to control when it's time to make more cells or not. And sometimes you make too many cells, and the body has a way of reducing the number of cells that you make, and that's called apoptosis. And so what happens in the case of cancer is that those mechanisms, those ways of controlling the amount of cells you make don't really function that well anymore. And so cancer cells have the ability to spread to other parts of the body as well. And we call this metastasis. So I study breast cancer, and breast cancer is one of those types of cancers that if you don't treat it early enough, those cells can actually enter the bloodstream and travel to different parts of the body. And that actually is what this image is showing you. It's not just, it's just a diagram of how cancer spreads. Not necessarily breast cancer, but in general, the way cancer spreads is that you have these cells which are in the darker blue color. Those cells are cancerous as compared to the other pink colored cells. Those are considered sort of the normal cells. And so what happens is that you have these barriers between your regular tissue and your bloodstream, okay? Because your bloodstream, your blood veins and arteries, they carry blood from different parts of the body. And so basically they carry oxygen by way of red blood cells to different parts of the body. They pick up carbon dioxide to exhale it from different parts of the body. So your blood travels throughout the body. And so if you don't catch cancer soon enough, it's possible that those cells do what we call invade other tissues. Those cells can break off, enter the bloodstream, and then travel. And you may have heard the term, oh, their cancer has spread. Oh, such and such, this person had cancer and it has now spread. That's what we're referring to. That term is called metastasis. And so, and you really want to prevent that from happening because it becomes difficult to treat. Because if you have cancer that's localized or in a certain location, One way to get rid of some cancers is to cut them out through surgery. Other ways is to treat patients with or give them what we call chemotherapy. And those will target cells and cause those cells to shrink or die. So that is the way you treat them. You either cause those cells to shrink or die, or you kill them.
Hey, Chico, not
Yes.
to interrupt, but we actually do have a question here.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yes. So Carter has a question. Can literally any type of cell in the human body get cancer?
That is our belief. Yes. So there's different, and every now and then we will recognize that there's this new cancer type that hasn't really been defined yet. But yes, so any cancer can become, I'm sorry, any cell can technically become cancerous. But is such a interesting dynamic in how that happens, because the body does have a way of fighting cancer off. I mean, so we have our natural immune system, which actually detects when a cell isn't behaving properly, and our natural immune system will kill off those cells. That is what they're designed to do. The problem is sometimes the changes in the genetics makes it tricky. And so it can actually hide the fact that these cancer cells are cancer cells, and they can overcome our immune system's ability to kill them. And so they can basically, the genetics can make them adapt to almost any environment. So that actually is a very good question. So any cell that has that, any cell can become cancerous. And so there's even, cells that don't normally grow and divide, such as their nerve cells. So it's well known that nerve cells, once they mature, they don't really tend to grow and divide, but there are cancers that come from nerve cells. Neuroblastoma is an example of a type of cancer that originates from a nerve cell. So I just described, one of the cells that's well known not to really grow and divide easily that can become cancerous. So very good question. Appreciate it. And almost 40% of the United States population will be diagnosed with cancer. And cancer typically it is diagnosed at later ages, because cancer is one of those diseases that's considered a disease of older age. And there's a few reasons for that. And that's because the more we are as humans is exposed to the environment, it increases what we call your risk of accumulating some of these changes in your genes. And as you accumulate or get more of these genetic changes, it makes it more difficult to control the way these cells grow. And out of that 40% of the population that will be diagnosed with cancer, roughly 20% or 1/5 of those folks, unfortunately, will pass from the disease. And that's why it's very important to have people to go into researching this disease in order to try to reduce that number. Great question, by the way. So now I just want to distinguish between a cancer versus a tumor. So, and you may have wondered this before or have heard, okay, such and such has a tumor. And what does that mean? So they actually are related to each other. And so starting over here on the left, we're calling this a benign tumor. These cells do grow, quote unquote, they grow, quote unquote, out of control, but they stop growing at a certain point. Okay, and so when we say out of control, there's a few more technical terms to that, and really get in that tonight. However, a tumor is an extra growth of cells, right? It's not supposed to be there. It's not normal to have a tumor, but tumors are more, you can cure tumors a lot easier. And how do you cure a tumor? You typically just cut a tumor out, and that takes care of it. But the problem is that if you don't find and locate tumors early, tumors can become cancerous, okay? So they both are the overgrowth of cells. And so it's believed most cancers, more than likely, originated from a tumor. And sometimes it can take many years and sometimes decades for you to feel the effects or symptoms from cancer. And so it takes a long time usually, not always, but it can take a long time for cancer to actually come about, for you to actually know that you have it. And a lot of times cancer is discovered by regular checkups. A person may not even know that that's what they have, and they may not have any symptoms when it comes to it. So regular checkups can give doctors sometimes clues as to what's normal, what's abnormal. And some cancers have these, what we call profiles, where it can show up in some regular tests. So you get blood screenings, and cancer cells tend to express certain proteins, and those can be picked up in some screenings that you do when you go to the doctor. So that's why it's important to get regular checkups. And that's sometimes why they will do blood work to figure out if there's something different going on or something that's out of range in what would be considered normal. And so in the case of benign tumors, those cells stay what we call localized in a certain region. And if you are able to detect it early, like I said, you can undergo surgery and cut it out. Or there's some times where people just watch the tumor and they just want to make sure it doesn't grow too large. They may not necessarily do a surgery to remove it. Sometimes you can take drugs or chemicals, and that will help in shrinking it. So there are occasions where tumors are not necessarily removed through surgery because it may be difficult to get to that location and actually remove it. And some tumors are benign, meaning they grow there and they don't really harm anything. The problem is that malignant tumors are cancer. So malignant means bad. That's sort of the definition of that term. They behave very differently than a tumor. So like I said, tumors stay localized. They stay in a certain location. The problem with cancer is they do not stay localized. So if you catch it early enough, the hope is that you will catch it early enough so you can cut it out like you would do a tumor, or treat it with some type of what we call chemotherapy. And you probably have heard that term before. And that will hopefully shrink it and sometimes get rid of it. That's possible, but it does depend on what the cancer type is. But if you don't catch it early enough, or if the treatment doesn't work, the cancer will continue to grow. And then it can grow into what we call invade neighboring tissues. And so now instead of being localized, it's actually moved into other areas where it's not supposed to be. And when that happens, those cells can break off, and you can see in green, some of those cells have actually broken off and entered those red tubes, which are your blood veins and blood vessels. And then it travels throughout your body. And it can basically take up a new residence in another location in the body. And like I said, that is what metastasis is, or when the cancer spreads. Okay, so that brings us to our next question. And I just want to see if you have any thoughts on what you're looking at. So I'll explain a little bit of what you're looking at. And so the question is, which of the following columns, okay, so we're going to look up and down, show breast cancer tissue? And so you are actually looking at slides, and this is called immunohistochemistry slides. And so these are actually tissue samples. And one set of these samples are cancerous. Another set of these samples are normal, and these are breast tissue. And so this is actually what a pathologist would do. And so you may have heard the term, or if not, I'll explain what that is. But a pathologist is a type of doctor that look at tissues and they identify what's called pathology or diseases, okay? So pathologists study diseases, and they look at these slides. This is a immunohistochemistry slide, and they basically look at these tissues side by side, and they recognize that they're different. You know, what are some of the similarities? And these slides would be made, for example, from what we call a biopsy. And I don't know if you've heard that term before, but if you've heard the term, a biopsy is when you actually take a small piece of the tissue sample, and it's these needles that has these, these needles kind of clip off small pieces of tissue. And you undergo surgery, you get a biopsy or localized surgery, depending on what you're sampling. And you basically put them on a microscope slide. And I'm assuming most of you all have seen a microscope slide before. And you have a immunohistochemist that would then take that slide, and they would slice the tissue into these very thin samples. They would then stain it with different dyes, and the dyes basically attach to proteins. They also attach to DNA. So we know DNA is very different than proteins. So those tissues are going to stain based upon how much protein is on the tissue versus how much DNA is in the tissue. And so that's really what you're looking at. And so what a pathologist does is look at the structure of the tissue sample. So on the left-hand side, it has a certain structure. I don't want to describe it yet. And on the right-hand side, it has a certain structure with it. So the question is, which of the following columns show breast cancer tissue?
All right, we have our responses and it is a dead tie. Half of our respondees think it's column A and half think it's column B. So which one is it?
There you go. So column A is breast cancer, while column B is normal tissue. So just let me explain a little bit of what you're looking at. So on the left-hand side at the top, it's more of a bird's eye view. So what's different between the top and the bottom is how close you are to the tissue. So the magnification is lower on the top left-hand side, and well, on the top, the top two panels. And then you are a little bit closer on the bottom two panels. So in the top two panels, look at the architecture and the structure. And so on the left-hand side, it's not as organized as the cells are on the right-hand side. So you can sort of see these tube-like structures on the right-hand side, but you don't see them well defined on the left-hand side. And another difference is the size of the cells. And so there's actually a little arrow here that's kind of pointing to a cell here. And as you can see on the right-hand side, and hopefully you can see my arrow, you can see these round structures. Those are the nuclei of cells. Over here, they're more elongated. They are larger. They're not as organized, right? And so you see some of these tube-like structures on the left-hand side, but over here, they're well organized, actually. And so that's normal tissue. And that's because in the breast, for example, you have lobules that produce milk, and they produce milk in these sacs. They're like sacs. And so in the accumulation of that milk, at some point, the milk will come out, assuming, the female is having a child and is going to feed their child milk, for example. And so that's sort of the architect of that particular tissue, the way it's structured. And then on the left-hand side, it's not well organized. And so down here on the bottom left, if you look inside these tubes, there's a full of cells there. That's not usual. That's not normal. And so on the right-hand side, there's not as many cells. You do have cells that flow in and out of your blood vessels throughout, but you don't have as many. It's more organized. It's not as crowded. And so in cancer, it's more crowded because there's more cells there. Okay, great. Let's move on. So what are some risk factors of cancer? So there's three major risk factors: the environment, your genetics, and age. So the older you get, unfortunately, it increases the risk of someone getting cancer. And that is related to the first two components of that. So over time, you're exposed to the environment longer, right? So if you're 15 years old, you've been on Earth 15 years, you've been exposed to the environment for 15 years. but your parent may be 45 years old. They've been exposed to the environment for 45 years. And so over time, we do what we call accumulate changes in our genes, and that's the genetics piece. So some cancers arise easier because of genetics, and that's because the person may have inherited these genes and they're not functioning the way they're supposed to, because we have two sets of genes as it relates to cells that grow and divide. We have some genes that promote cell growth and encourage it, right? So as you're growing from that single cell organism to a multicellular organism, you need to promote growth. So you're getting bigger, you're getting taller, right? So there's many changes that occur as you're going through that growth and development stage. And so over time, however, going from 15 years old to 45 years old, you now have 30 more years where those cells are exposed to the environment. You're exposed, let's say you live, unfortunately, in a place that's highly polluted. You spend a lot of time outside and they're exposed to UV light. Maybe someone has picked up bad habits as they gotten older, such as smoking cigarettes. So all these things sort of play a role. And then the older you get, all those different problems just kind of add up. And so just kind of keep that in mind. So that adds to what we call a risk factor. A risk factor basically means one of these factors increases the chances that you may get cancer. You may not get cancer, but it increases the chances that that may happen. There's different subtypes of breast cancer. I won't really go into that, but I wanted to show you that there's different types. And so because there's different types, you have to treat them differently. And so that's very important. So that's what a lot of research comes into play, understanding how these different types work, so there's going to be different treatments for these different types. And that's because these cells behave very differently from each other, and they may come from different places in that particular tissue, for example. And so these are some of the things that we study in my laboratory. And there are these recommendations that women get screened for breast cancer. But what's important too, to realize men can also get breast cancer. It's a very small percentage, but men has breast tissue as well. It's just that women has their breast tissue is more dynamic. So there's lots of changes that occur because of the hormone changes that when females undergo throughout their life. And so here, and I'm going to go through a couple of these slides a little bit faster to get to some of the major points I wanted to make, but just to show you the devastation that can come from this particular type of cancer is that in 2019, and this is in the United States, there was an estimated over 271,000 cases of breast cancer being diagnosed, and about 42,000 deaths related to breast cancer. And so, that's a challenge that we definitely want to work to overcome and reduce those numbers. So it's very important. So that's a death rate of about 20%, unfortunately. And part of the research that I do is to try to understand why that's the case, and also why there's differences between different groups when it comes to getting breast cancer and unfortunately dying from it. So that brings us to the last poll. And I'm just curious, not the last poll, I think this is the next to last, but I'm just curious, have you ever heard of this term, cancer health disparity? And that's one of the poll questions. You may have heard of the term health disparity, or may not. And so I'm just curious if you've heard of that before.
All right, so the results are in, and 9 of the respondees say that they have heard of the term cancer health disparity, and 3 people said no.
Okay, all right. Well, good. So it's a very important kind of concept to think about, especially if you, and maybe some of you all are now thinking, oh, wow, I might want to look into this. And so what does that mean? So cancer health disparities is when certain groups are disproportionately burdened. So what does that mean, disproportionately burdened? So that means it's unequal cases, right? So the cases are higher than it should be, or an unequal number of deaths. So let's say instead of a 20% death rate is 50%. And so that usually means there's other factors that play a role in those disparities. And so that's part of what I study. And so here is just some overall cases of breast cancer cases. And I mentioned that men can get breast cancer as well. So it's related to those numbers we talked about before. And one thing that I focus on in my research is differences in some racial and ethnic groups as well. And this is the estimated breakdown in the United States. And this becomes an interesting difference in some of the disparities that we talk about, that I'm gonna talk about here briefly in a second. And that's because if you can reduce some of the disparities, you actually will end up reducing the overall rates of incidences and death rates when it comes to cancer. So it's just a different way of trying to address the problem in dealing with cancer burdens. So if you can figure out a way to tackle that, then that makes it a little bit easier to do. And so here, I just want to briefly show you, and some of this data actually is going to be updated next week. And so there's a forum that is happening on the 16th of September through the American Association for Cancer Research. So they basically gather this data in these 5-year chunks of time, and then they put out these reports. And so this data will be updated by next Friday. So, you know, if you're interested, you can go look for these numbers to get an idea of what the numbers are, what do they remain. And so here's the incidence rates of all women. And here shows you sort of the breakdown of the differences. And so if you notice here, even though, and that's why I show this here, the population of the United States is only 13.4% Black African American, the incidence rate is the second highest. It's right next to what the majority, which is Caucasian white Americans, have. And so even though Caucasian white Americans make up 60% of the population, and the incidence rates are still high, so we still want to reduce those numbers, but there's it's even higher in that smaller group of African American and Black women. Now this shows the death rate, and so this actually shows the disparity is more stark. It actually is more obvious this way. So this is the death rate, and so we, just to compare, this is the incidence rate. So while Caucasian African American, Caucasian white women have higher cases, number of cases, Black women actually die at higher rates. And so that is what we call the disparity. And the question is, you know, why is that the case? And so there's many different factors that scientists and doctors are trying to understand why is that the case. And some of it's genetic, some of it may be access to healthcare, some of it may be environmental. And it's just hard to know unless you do the research. And part of that is due to this cancer called triple negative breast cancer, which is a specific type of cancer that I study in my lab. And the reason why I do that is study this particular cancer type is because it's been shown to have higher cases in the African American community, and it may play a role in why there's such a great disparity. And so this is just one way to try to tackle that disparity and reduce the numbers. Now, all groups get this particular type of breast cancer, all ethnic racial groups, but for some reason, it's more aggressive in African American Black women, and we don't really know why. And so that's part of the thing that I study. And so it's called triple negative because this particular cancer is missing 3 things. And 3 things that is missing are these proteins that scientists have identified as being targets for other cancer types. But because that cell doesn't have them, you can't target it. And so there's no what we call drug-targeted treatments for this type of cancer. It tends to be the most aggressive form of breast cancer. Like I said, very few treatments. And so it's very deadly, unfortunately. And so that's just one of the cancers that I study in my laboratory, and trying to understand the genetics behind this particular type of cancer. And that's just a resource here that you can, and it is a short video, but I'm not going to play the video. But you can Google and actually find some nice videos on YouTube that describes some of these cancer types, so that you can, become more knowledgeable about this particular field of science. And we are encouraging young people. Like I said, I'm not going to play the video. We want to encourage more students to really engage in cancer research and just or treating cancer patients. And I do a lot of work with the UNC Chapel Hill Lineberger Cancer Center. I'm actually involved in creating a course that is for the general public as well when it comes to outreach and studying, not only studying cancer, but also patient advocacy, in increasing people's interest in clinical trials, perhaps, and maybe that's one way we can reduce some of the cancer in the United States. And so here's my contact information. You're always free to contact me, and I can answer questions for you and send you resources, connect you with people if you're interested in this research area. And I believe that kind of concludes my presentation. And so I put this here: keep calm and spread awareness of breast cancer. So like I said, next month, October, is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So definitely look out for those type of resources and opportunities to get involved, and just really consider, studying cancer as a future career. And that is one way to serve your community. So are there any more questions? So that actually brings me to the conclusion of the presentation.
While we wait for questions to come in, I do have a quick question. Well, maybe not a quick question. It might be a bear, but how would you go about isolating the variables while you're trying to figure out whether it's environmental, genetic, like in your lab or in one of the experiments to determine, like, how do you do that?
Yeah, that actually is very challenging. And so that actually becomes a collaboration, really. So while I'm a basic scientist, and which means I study these things in the lab using cells, there's others who may use what we call animal models. And so those animal models are in highly controlled environments. But then we also work with epidemiologists. And so the epidemiologists are looking at data as far as, where the patients come from, or the patients in areas where there's a high incidence of this certain pollutant, and maybe that's playing a role. So it does become challenging, and that's what makes this kind of research interesting. You're always learning something doing this type of research. It's complicated and complex, but it also makes it very interesting. So it has to be a network of people that come together, and we have conferences and try to come up with some answers to that exact question that you just asked.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we have a question from one of the attendees.
Okay.
Has the incidence of breast cancer remained stable in recent years, or has it been increasing or decreasing?
I like that question. So it's very, very good question. So I'll put it this way. So there's one way of looking at it. There's rates, and then there's raw numbers. So the rates actually are going down slightly, but the raw numbers are going up. So it can be a little bit confusing. So more people, and that's because there's more people, right? So the more people you have in a population, that can give you sort of not really a false reading, because it is the real reading, but it gives a false sense of security. So the numbers are still kind of high. The rates, like I said, are going down, but the numbers are still sort of on the high side. And, it's hard to know why that's the case. Now, they've come down quite dramatically from what they were a couple of decades ago. And part of that is that a lot of people are now more conscious about the environment. You have more people who are interested in reducing pollution. you have less people who smoke cigarettes, for example, because smoking cigarettes not only increases your risk of lung cancer, it increases your risk of all types of cancer. And so that has helped dramatically improve the outcomes of cancer, because really when I think it was in the 90s or so, late 90s or so, there really was a push on reducing smoking cigarettes. And that has had a positive effect on the incidence rates. And we feel like that has played a major role in this reduction of incidence in the cases of cancer, because less people are smoking. However, over the last couple of years, vaping has become popular. And so that's a whole nother story. We're not sure what that's going to mean later, because we do know that has toxic effects as well. So it's one of those things, it takes a while for the results to show up, but we do know that it's a problem, and it's a growing problem. So we'll see what happens with those numbers in a few years. Great question.
So we have another question here. How did you first get interested in studying cancer? And also, Violet also says, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Oh, wow. Thank you for having me. So that's a very good question. So how did I get started? When I was in college, so let me give a little bit of background. So I'm actually first generation college student. So I didn't know what I wanted to do when I went to college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Now, I was pretty sure I wanted to be a teacher, though. I really love that. I love my teachers, all of my teachers I've ever had. And so I wanted to do something where I could do my passion of teaching, but also do something that will benefit the greater society. And so when I was in undergraduate, there was one of my favorite professors my freshman year, and he did breast cancer research, actually. And so he used to talk about it in class, in my biology class. And I said, wow, okay, I might try this research out. I wasn't really sure what research was, to be honest. I mean, I did do science fairs and those kind of things when I was in middle school and high school, but I didn't know a lot about scientists, like how to become a scientist. And so really his mentorship is what helped guide me into that. And so I joined his laboratory as a college student. And really that was how I got started. So I've really been doing cancer research since then. And so he was my college freshman biology professor. So I started in college, and I actually was an undecided major. Didn't know what I was going to major in, and that helped me decide. I really enjoyed his class. I really loved science. I always loved science, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And that helped me decide what I wanted to do. And so basically that is when I decided to try this career, and here I am many years later.
So a follow-up question related to that. If you weren't studying cancer research, what would you be studying, or what would you be doing? Would you still be a scientist?
I feel like I would. Now, what type, I'm not sure. I was very interested in math. So I think when I first went to college, I thought about being a math teacher. I wanted to be a teacher. I just know I wanted to be a teacher. And so I really liked math. I didn't get a chance I did some biology in high school, but that freshman biology class is really what did it for me. So I would put it this way: I would be some type of teacher, for sure. I don't know if it would be biology or not, because sometimes you don't know what you like until you experience it, until you are exposed to it. And so that is what happened to me as a freshman, is I didn't know about this world of cancer research, of biology, until I had a great professor. And the professor is really what made me realize, wow, I really want to look more into that career, because I really liked what he was doing. And he talked about the benefits of his research and how it benefited society. And I really liked that. And that's how I got started. So I would be in someone's classroom. It happens to be biology, and I really love it.
So we have two more, well, one comment and one question. Eva says, thanks so much for presenting as well. She's another member of the Teen Advisory Board along with Violet.
Thank you.
And then Will asks, do cancer researchers typically have an MD degree or a PhD? Hold on, the rest of the question. Let me,
Okay.
does it depend on the type of research you want to conduct?
Very good question. It can be MD or PhD, or it can be a combination MD, PhD. So there are three categories of people who do research in this area. You can get a master's and do research in this area. You can be an undergraduate and with the bachelor's degree and do research in this area as well. So it really does depend to a certain extent. So a lot of your researchers who do what we call clinical research, so that is actually doing research on patients, those scientists tend to have an MD or an MD PhD. So I'm what you would call a basic scientist. And so what that means is that we are in the laboratory and we're working with cells in a what we call a petri dish, or some people have what we call animal models, and they use those models to study cancer. And so a lot of what we do as basic scientists is then used by what we call the translational scientists, those are the MDs and MD PhDs, to implement our findings in trying to help patients. So it's kind of a team effort because a lot of things that we do as basic scientists, we're just investigating and trying to understand some of the intricacies of how this cell actually works. And then you can use that information to now try and, combat that in a patient. And so an MD has a lot more knowledge about the body, right? Because they're dealing with patients and interacting with live people a lot more than the PhDs do. And so their specialty is to try to implement what we find behind, what we call behind the scenes.
Okay, so I have two more questions from the audience. First is, what is the best way to get into research in college? And can I extend that to also high school too?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, so, you just asked the question. And so we actually have at North Carolina A&T what's called an early STEM college, but then there's also some students who come from some of the local high schools, and they actually get started doing research. I've actually have had high school students before, locally, of course, in Greensboro. And part of, I think, his senior project, we did some stuff using cells, and we were looking at cells in the microscope. We were testing out different chemicals on the cells to see how the cells responded. And that happened because his sister happened to be a student in one of my classes, and his sister asked, hey, my brother's interested in doing this senior project. Can you join your lab? And I said, sure. And so it really does depend on the lab and the ability of that scientist to be able to do that. But a lot of scientists will do it. And so you have to get the courage and ask. And it basically is the same thing in college, is that you can look out and search out scientists or researchers, professors doing research in the college and ask. So we get those requests a lot. And some students are in honors programs or different programs on campus where they do research. Some students get paid as undergraduates to do research. There's programs that will pay you a stipend, actually, and will pay you to do research in the laboratory. There's some programs that have summer internships where you can go there and do research in the laboratory for 6 to 8 weeks. When I was in college, I went to college at Clark Atlanta in Atlanta, Georgia, but I did a summer program in Tucson, Arizona, at the University of Arizona, and I was there for 2 months. And so, yeah, so there's many ways to get involved, and I would say the earlier, the better, because, a lot of times we keep a list of students who's interested, and many times it's on a first come basis. So if it's something you're interested in, you definitely want to start sooner rather than later.
Okay, and the second question is, how far away do you think we are from a cure, or will we never have one?
Very good question. So I was actually talking about this earlier in another forum I was in. So I think it's possible that we can have what I call mini victories, MINI victories. And that's because cancer is so complex. And like I mentioned before, there's over 100 different types. So I do think for certain subtypes of cancers that we can find treatments and cures that work pretty well. There's some other ones we need more time. Because genetics is such a complicated thing, and then the environment plays a role in that, it makes it difficult to come up with, one treatment or one cure for a particular type of cancer. But, many people are working very hard to try to do just that. And so it's going to take a little bit more time, probably. It's going to take more people getting involved, becoming scientists themselves and working in this field. And each person that comes on board has some new ideas to bring to the table. And that's part of the importance of having more people involved, diversity involved, because you have ideas that other people may not have thought of.
So pretty much the advice that you would give the folks participating in this presentation today, if they are interested in doing research, is to contact their counselors to see if there's any programs that they know of in their area involving research, to do some research on their own, like Google schools or Google fields of research, and contact those professors. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a great point you just made, because there may be some programs already through the school that you already attend that has opportunities. And I know there's a number of faculty at North Carolina A&T who host students in their labs, and a lot of times they are high school students. So yes, so it's best to investigate, starting with your counselor's office. And then there are some summer programs that may become available. I know it's a little bit tricky now because we're not sure how things are going to look due to the pandemic, but the research still has to continue. And so there's even virtual research opportunities now. And so that has become the new way of conducting research. And it's not necessarily in the lab, but there's what's called bioinformatics. And so you can do that virtually. And so that's going to become a very important component to studying cancer, because you can take the genetics of a cancer cell, compare that to the genetics of a normal cell, and using bioinformatics, that gives you an idea of some of the differences between the cancer and normal cells. And you use those differences as a way to try to understand why a cancer cell behaves the way it does. And if you can look at those differences between why a cancer cell behaves the way it does by way of genetics, then that gives you an idea of maybe you can treat by way of combating that protein or that gene in the cancer cell and make it look more, quote unquote, I guess you can say normal, behave more normally. And so bioinformatics is definitely, if you are into computers or bioinformatics, coding, those kind of things, it actually makes it a little bit easier to get into some of the research now, especially since a lot of things are virtual. And so you can actually become, I'm sure there's opportunities for that, at least under these conditions, to get involved in virtual research. And that'll make it a lot easier when it's time to get into the actual lab and do some of the research in the laboratory.
Great. Well, I think that was our last question. And that is about all the time we have anyway. Dr. Rory, thanks so much for joining us. That was
Thank you.
Great. And yeah, great start to the new cafe season. And then attendees, if you could please fill out that survey if you have not done so already. And if you do not notice the links, there should be 4. I forgot to label the 4th one. Also, we will be making an Instagram for the Teen Science Cafe. It will be a closed group. But it'll just have cool science facts. It'll have information about upcoming cafes, and it'll just be a little bit less clunky than the listserv that we have now. So we'll probably have that up and running sometime over the next month, but we will send out information during the next cafe so you can follow us. And that's about all we got. So again, thanks for joining us, and y'all have a great weekend.